Good morning, everybody. Today is November 12th, and let's go ahead and pick up where we left off. World War I is so remarkable in how it changed the old world and brought in the new, and there is so much complexity to what happened, and so much took place in just that 4-year time frame. I can assure you I'm really only scratching the surface here. So looking into this on your own is something that I would really hope that you will do. There is a fantastic podcast series called The Great War. And the producer of it decided in 2014 to start covering World War I week by week. And so each week in 2014, 15, 16, etc., corresponded with exactly that week 100 years earlier. And it's a terrific podcast. It's really, really neat. He used quite a few impressive sources, and I thought that I knew the war pretty well. I certainly studied it an awful lot, read a lot of books on it, took a couple of classes on it, more than one. And it turns out there was still material I didn't know, because this guy was going into certain areas that I had never really even studied. So it's a really, really complex series of events. And so what I'm trying to say is I'm only scratching the surface here. I'm only telling you the basics to get you to understand how much change took place. You'll notice I'm not really getting into the military strategy, who fought who, when, and where. Which battle was this and which battle was that. And it isn't that I don't think that that's significant, but what really matters is the outcome of the war, right? What really matters is who won, who lost. And when it comes to warfare and these military conflicts, and so many of them really do change the world, I always find the diplomacy, I find the human interaction far more interesting than who shot where on the battlefield. Right? You know, battles are just a bunch of people throwing metal at each other, but the diplomacy and the workings behind the scene is always so much more intricate. So that tends to be what I focus on. But what we do need to know is that over the course of those 4 years, between 1914 and 1918, a war of attrition set in, with the belligerent powers basically, like I said, just throwing metal at each other, and of course millions of young men. And the survivor of the war was going to end up being the one that didn't run out. You know, that's really all it got down to. It was a war of production, who can produce the most stuff and who can put the most soldiers in the field to use it. And the Central Powers, Germany and Austria, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, just simply couldn't keep up with what we would call the Allied powers, Britain, France, Russia, and later the United States. And so over time, those nations just wore themselves down. But the losses on each side were just absolutely massive. An entire generation of young men, mostly in Europe, but in other places as well, were just wiped out completely, just gone. It was terrible. That generation, the group of men that were born roughly between 1890 and 1900, which were the bulk of the soldiers during World War I, have since been called the lost generation, because either they really were gone, they didn't exist anymore, or they were so mentally damaged as a result of their experiences that they never were able to have the productive, prosperous lives that we would hope people in the modern era would have. And some of the data is just really disturbing. You look at, for example, in Germany, if you look at the men that were born, say, between the year 1890 and 1895, the number that survived, the number that survived in that age group is just astronomically low. Where did all these men go? I mean, there's entire, regions where men that age, and of course, as we moved into the 20th century, as they got older, there's just not many of them at all. And that will have other social impacts as well, because what about the women, right? How are these women going to find men to marry if all the young men are either dead or messed up in one way or another? And so it affects them as well, right? How are we going to raise another generation without both the men and the women being, healthy and capable of doing it? The impact of the war was far beyond what just happened during those 4 years, and really, really complex to wrap our head around all the different changes. It probably is not a coincidence that we did go into World War II. There's all sorts of reasons why World War I led to World War II, but one reason for it was probably that the people were still so psychologically stressed as a result of the First War that it opened the door for the events that led to the second one. So it's really, really worth studying. Anyway, but to what we're talking about, when we left off, at the end of 1916, everybody was sick of this war. Everybody wanted it to end. And Germany was really feeling the strain of this war. Germany was in a really bad place. But Germany also thought, we're in a position to win. Yes, it's been hard, but we can do this. Russia is backed against the ropes. Russia will be out of this war in one way or another within a few months. Germany knew that, and quite frankly, everyone else did as well. The French are in open mutiny at this point. The French definitely want out, and the French are having a very difficult time keeping up. And so really the only nation left to bring to the table would be the British, would be Britain. And Britain is being supplied by the United States. And so if we can break that tie to the U.S., if we can choke Britain off, we will now be in a position to force these allies to work with us. Now also, just to let you know, by the end of 1916, the German leadership also understood that if things kept going as they were, they couldn't hold out much longer. The Germans understood we're running out of gas really, really quickly. German industry has been pushed to the limit. German casualties are now astronomically high. So one way or another, we have to end this war pretty quickly if we intend to end it on our terms. And so Germany is in a difficult place. And what that led to was, during 1917, Russia eventually did get pulled out of the war. Germany sent Vladimir Lenin in. He sparked a socialist revolution, which I absolutely intend to talk about later, which did get Russia out. So that maybe puts Germany in a position to win. Right now we can focus everything on the French, bring all of those soldiers from the Eastern Front over to fight on the Western Front. But Germany also made a terrible mistake by engaging in unrestricted submarine warfare, that decision to cut Britain off from the United States, which meant that they were going to start torpedoing American merchant vessels, thinking that the United States would just simply back off and do nothing. The opposite happened. In April, the United States declares war on Germany. The German leadership is still very confident that their submarines in the Atlantic can be very effective at keeping the Americans out of Europe. We'll sink all of their troop ships, we'll sink all of their supply ships. It won't matter if they're at war with us because there's nothing they can do. And that proved to be just woefully short-sighted. The Germans had no real understanding of the kind of power they were going against when they chose to pick a fight with the United States. The United States was the world's #1 industrial power by that point. And you see what they didn't factor in, and you don't have to write this down. I'm going into a little more detail. But what they didn't factor in was that the United States had already been supplying Britain with all of these war materials for the first 2 years, purely in the interest of making money. We were officially neutral, but businessmen will sell to anybody that will buy their stuff. So what that meant is that the United States could gear up for war really quickly because all of our factories were already in a position to produce bombs and bullets and canteens and uniforms, right? We were already making a lot of that stuff and sending it to the British. Now, we weren't 100% mobilized. We still had to kind of do that, but you get the factories in line. But we were more ready to go to war than Germany had predicted. And also, and again, this is something the Germans didn't quite get. Germany had proposed a secret agreement with Mexico, and realizing that the United States could be a problem, Germany offered Mexico, I'm not making this up, the American Southwest if Mexico would go to war with the United States. And the United States and Mexico were not on very good terms at this particular point. As a matter of fact, in 1916, the United States briefly invaded Mexico looking for a bandito named Pancho Villa. And there was another incident called the Tampico incident, which was a sort of a diplomatic problem, which I won't get into. But we were not very good friends with Mexico. And as students of American history know we had actually taken the American Southwest from Mexico a few decades earlier in the Mexican War. And so that had actually been part of Mexico for a long time. And so Germany had secretly proposed Mexico go to war with the United States, and when this is all over and when we've all won, we will give you all of the territory that those Americans took from you. Now, this was an absurd notion. Mexico was not about to play along with it. And it was discovered. Some British intelligence officers found this. It was known as the Zimmermann Telegraph. I guess I'll write it down. The Zimmermann Telegraph. They published it in American newspapers, and it only angered the United States more toward Germany, because now Germany is openly advocating that the United States be attacked. Well, what does this all lead to? Well, the Germans did not factor this in. Beginning about 1916, the United States military started modernizing. The U.S. military realized that it was inadequate, that basically what we had was an army geared toward fighting on the frontiers of the Southwest, not an army geared toward fighting a modern industrial conflict. And so over the course of about a couple of years, really about a year, we changed everything about the U.S. military, and the modern military actually comes out of that. So when we declared war in April of 1917, we were actually a lot more prepared than the Germans had thought. The Germans assumed that the U.S. military was just a bunch of Indian fighters, when in fact we were much more modern than that. So the Germans just miscalculated. There's no other way to put it. And once again, I'm not getting into all the different battles and strategies, but just know, within just a few months of declaring war, toward the end of 1917, American soldiers were already pouring into France, supporting the French, supporting the British. By early 1918, it was a flood of fresh, young, well-trained American soldiers, absolutely equipped with the best stuff. And the Germans couldn't fight back. The Germans could not respond to that effectively. So by the spring of 1918, the Germans really tried to do one last push, more or less as just a way to be strong enough to negotiate an end. And by September of 1918, war's over. Germany has been pushed back on all fronts. All across the Western Front, Germany is now being pushed into its own territory. And there was a very real fear that before the end of the year, the Allies would then invade Germany. All of that French territory that they had been occupying, including Belgium, was now gone. And there was a lot of debate that maybe we should just go ahead and bring it to Berlin. That once we've driven the French out of France and Belgium, once we've driven the Germans out of France and Belgium, just go on in and take it all the way to Berlin. But we decided not to do that. We could have, we could have done that. And that turned out to be probably short-sighted. Maybe that would have been a better option. But what we need to know is that the war's over in 1918. America did it. America came in and saved the French and saved the British.
I have a question.
Yes.
Did the U.S. suffer as many casualties as Britain?
That's a great question. Did the U.S. suffer as many casualties? The answer is not even close. The American, we're talking World War I in perspective here. America lost roughly 48 to 50,000 men killed. Now, wounded would have been more than that, but actual dead soldiers was somewhere in the neighborhood of 50,000. Millions on the other, in the other powers were lost. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 million were killed in the war. So America's loss was much, much smaller. I forget, it's something like 6 million, 8 million Germans died during the war. Again, in terms of how many Russians died, honestly, nobody even knows. So yeah, it was not. And what we also have to keep in mind is that we didn't get attacked in any way, right? There were no bombs or bullets at all shot on American soil. So when the war was over, our industry was in terrific shape, right? We were in fantastic shape economically. And just to let you know, we had loaned a whole lot of money to Britain and France as the war was going on to help them pay for their own war. And now the bill's coming due. And so our economy is going to get even stronger as we're collecting all of the money that these nations owe us. And so World War I bankrupted Europe, but it really boosted us. And it was the fact that we didn't lose a lot of men, and it was not a real long, drawn-out war for us, plays a big role in that. So I'm glad you brought that up. And on that note, we're actually going to bring it up, because now what we have to do is figure out how we're going to rebuild Europe. What are we going to do now that the war is over? Because Europe has been so catastrophically devastated. So catastrophically devastated. And I don't have the map I want. I'm going to have to pause this video in just a second. Well, I've mentioned the fact that Vladimir Lenin took over Russia and is going to create a new state out of that. But in 1919, a very large peace conference was held in Paris. And this would later be known simply as the Paris Peace Conference. And the peace treaty would be signed at Versailles. And so it will simply be called the Versailles Treaty. It will be called the Versailles Treaty. What we need to know is that in the closing days of the war, the German Empire fully collapsed, the Kaiser abdicated his throne, and Germany was declared a republic. So the German Empire ceases to exist. The Russian imperial government has also collapsed, so there is no more Russian Empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed. So there is no more Austrian Empire. And a whole bunch of new states will come out of that. The Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire that had existed since the 15th century, it also collapsed. So we've already talked about the fact that the Ottoman Empire is gasping for air at this point anyway, and the war is what pushed it over the edge. And so a whole new series of Middle Eastern countries are going to come out of that. And we have to draw new borders and create new states that simply hadn't existed before. So if you look at the modern borders of the Middle East, nations like Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, these are all nations that were drawn after World War I. And like we talked about in Africa and Asia, a lot of the borders for these nations are not actually culturally accurate. The British and the French just went in and drew maps based on geography and gave different tribal leaders the power. And if you want to know one of the reasons why the Middle East remains so unstable is the fact that these were artificial borders to begin with. Iraq, for example, is a nation that is very multicultural, probably not the best way to create new countries. But anyway, so all of these very established old empires are now dissolving. We have to create new nations out of them. Are they going to be republics? Are they going to embrace socialism? Are they going to embrace free market capitalism? Lots of questions to answer. At the Paris Peace Conference, and I'm only focusing on the Germans here, Germany was led to believe that this would be a fair negotiation, that all of the different powers from all of the different nations would come together and we will all sit around a table and we will work this out and put this unpleasantness behind us. In other words, Germany believed that there would be fair treatment. And it is worth remembering when we go into this, and here's a problem to remember. We did not invade Germany and conquer the capital. We stopped at the German border. And even though the Germans were clearly defeated, the German army withdrew intact. The German army did not collapse in the field. And for that matter, neither did the Russian army, but we don't need to mention that. They were whipped and they knew it. When they went home, They were met as heroes. The soldiers are going back to their towns and villages, and the people of Germany are cheering them on. Thank you for your service. You get what I'm saying. And a belief sort of emerged among the German people that this wasn't really a defeat, that this really was an armistice. This was an agreement to stop fighting. But I'm looking around and I'm seeing an awful lot of German soldiers here that are coming home. And if we really wanted to keep going, we could have. So we weren't really beat. We just agreed to stop fighting. That's a very quick concept that pops up in the minds of the German people. And so this is going to be a negotiation. Y'all get where I'm coming from. Well, the truth is Germany was beat, plain and simple. And getting off track, the American general, by the way, military should not conduct foreign policy. Our military is there to take orders from our civilian leaders. But the American general, a man by the name of John Pershing, who led the American forces in Europe, just was furious that we stopped at the German border. I mean, he made it clear this is a huge mistake. If we're going to end this war, we have to end this war with everyone in Germany knowing that they got beat, knowing that there was no way they were going to win. We need to send our troops all the way to Berlin and camp out in the Reichstag building and say, this is our country now, and, make the Germans understand that they can never do this again. Maybe if we had done that, right, we wouldn't have, because very quickly in the 1920s, the Germans will now come to firmly argue we didn't lose this war at all. As a matter of fact, we were winning the war, and it all sort of went south because of other factors. And Pershing insisted, if we don't teach those doggone Germans a lesson, they are not going to be peaceful. And we all saw what happened. And you'll notice during World War II, in the closing of World War II, as it is very obvious that Germany will not win, the Nazi leadership continued to reach out and say, let's make peace, let's make peace, let's make peace. Hitler was doing everything possible to try to create some sort of negotiated peace, and we would not do it. I mean, we marched all the way to Berlin, the Russians more specifically. But Germany was conquered all the way through, and Germany was occupied. So the German people had to understand we lost. Anyway, back to it. What happened at the Paris Peace Conference was not what the Germans expected. There was a peace that was dictated to them by the winners. The German leadership was not given a fair seat at the table. And for that matter, neither were the Austrians or the Turks or anyone else. The American president, and that's top hat in the middle there, is Woodrow Wilson. Wilson is a brilliant diplomat. There's no question about it. And what we also see there are the French and British leaders. There's Clemenceau there tipping his hat, doesn't matter. But Wilson saw what was going on and was deeply concerned by it. And so Wilson went to the Paris Peace Conference thinking that this is going to be, needs to be something much more than just an end to this war. What we need to do is reshape global diplomacy. We need to completely revise how nations work together. And now remember, he's coming from a different perspective. Number one, he's coming from an American perspective. He is not European. And he's also coming from a nation that did not fight in this war for a long time. And in his mind, a nation that came in and actually ended it. Because if he hadn't come in, if the United States had stayed out of this war, we could be fighting into 1919, 1920. Who knows when these crazy Europeans are going to quit killing each other. And Wilson pushed on all of the leadership a couple of ideas. First and foremost, he did not blame Germany for the war. He blamed all of them for the war. He said whatever set of events that led to the beginning of this war that belonged to Germany, and Germany was clearly the aggressor whenever this started. His answer is, let's be honest, it was the system that failed. The Austrians refusing to cooperate with the Serbs, the Russians getting involved in business that wasn't theirs, them mobilizing their army. Yes, of course, the Germans getting involved as well. But what about these alliance systems, right? Where we have this triple alliance. What about the triple entente? These nations that all work together and agree to all go to war at once. Well, you're not going to solve any problems that way. We're not going to sit around a table and negotiate when the plan in advance is to fight each other rather than talk, right? I mean, of course, we're going to end up with this big, nasty war. So Wilson blamed them all. He said, every one of you needs to be ashamed of yourselves. There is no villain here unless you all take responsibility for it. That was the first point that he made. Point number 2 is that we can't keep doing this. We just simply cannot keep doing this. For hundreds of years, European nations used war as an extension of their foreign policy. That's how they negotiated with each other. When I want something and you want something, what we're going to do is fight a war, and then the winner dictates the terms. That's how Europe does it. Look at Louis XIV, right? Louis XIV never negotiated with anybody. He made demands and then sent in his army, which clearly means he didn't give a damn about the young men that were getting killed, right? Henry VIII did the same thing. Look at the Spanish. Look at all of them were that way. Warfare is part of the European diplomatic system. It always has been. And Wilson said, we cannot do this anymore. We have to completely change. And the reason is very obvious. The technology has made it possible to slaughter millions and millions of people in these wars. And it's only going to get worse. You better believe that in the next few decades, we're going to invent new weapons that are vastly more powerful than what we already have. And so you know what? I don't know how the next war is going to be fought, but the one after that's going to be fought with sticks and stones. Okay, the one after that's going to be fought with people living in caves, like the Neanderthals from thousands of years ago, because that's all that's going to be left of human civilization if we keep this up. Y'all get where I'm coming from, right? So Wilson said, if we want to save humanity, we have to stop fighting each other. Technology has now made it so we have no choice. Wilson was dismissed. He was seen as naive. He was seen as some sort of an outsider coming in here telling us Europeans how to do our business. Wilson proposed what he called the 14 points. And he had proposed this actually before the war was even over. He was already putting this out there for the European leadership to look at. And this was his plan for a new world order where conflict would be resolved around a negotiating table rather than on a battlefield. Now, I'm not getting into every aspect of the 14 points. I'm just going to tell you a few things that matter. Number 1, end militarism, meaning nations should not have large armies during peacetime. Nations should not have large armies during peacetime. You're not at war with anybody. You don't need a big army. And if everybody agrees to that, we won't be in a position to fight whenever we have differences. There's an old saying, if you're a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. Let's do a quick little analogy. We're sitting in a bar and we're having a few drinks, and I don't really like you so much and you don't really like me so much, or maybe we've got some other kind of disagreement. And we start having words with each other. And we're being unreasonable, and obviously the alcohol is speaking more than our common sense. And you start saying things to me that I really don't want to hear. Now, I might get really angry at you and I might punch you in the nose, right? Or I might really threaten you and tell you, all kinds of things that you don't want to hear. Now, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? Someone's going to get a bloody nose. Now, let's take the same scenario, but in your back pocket, you've got a revolver. And now I'm telling you things you don't want to hear, and I'm pushing you around, and I'm bullying you, and I'm getting all up in your face. And right back here, you've got a gun. Are you going to back down? Are you going to say, hey, let's just calm down and talk this over? Maybe the Atlanta Falcons don't suck nearly as much as you think. Right? No, you're not. When you're walking around with a gun in your back pocket, you don't take crap from anybody, do you? That is liquid courage when you drink alcohol. And that gun is the armor. Now, if I don't have a gun and you don't have a gun and all we have are our fists, again, maybe we'll punch each other in the nose, but nobody gets killed. And you know what? Maybe I'm worried about whether or not I really can take you, right? And you're worried. Maybe I'm talking to, some sort of judo master here, and maybe I ought to watch myself because I don't really know. So maybe we'll calm things down because we don't really understand. The minute you give somebody a gun, you change their personality across the board. One of the current buzzwords today that everybody uses is road rage, right? What happens when road rage happens and someone has a pistol in the car? They start flashing that gun. And then somebody else flashes the gun. And somebody gets shot over something as stupid as getting cut off in traffic. How about we take the guns away? How about we not have people walking around with guns? We're still going to have conflicts with each other. I'd rather see them resolved with a bloody nose or maybe a dented fender. And that's what Wilson is saying on a national level. If I don't have a big army, you don't have a big army, they don't have a big army, I don't get to bully you, and you don't get to bully me, and we're going to be a lot more likely to sit down and talk it out. But when I've got that big army, think of Austria, right? Austria bullied the daylights out of the Serbs because Austria had a big army, and Austria knew Germany was backing them up. And the Serbs pushed back against the Austrians because the Serbs knew the Russians are backing them up. I've got a big brother there who's going to teach you a lesson. Take it off the table. No more big armies. Number 2, no more secret treaties and alliances. No more secret negotiations on diplomatic levels. All diplomacy between nations needs to be public and out in the open. Again, secret treaties and alliances only lead to conflict because there's issues that the other side might not know about. Number 3, open navigation of the sea. The sea belongs to nobody. Nobody can control the water. Any nation can navigate anywhere in the world any way they want. Add to this, number 4, free trade. We should eliminate tariffs. We should eliminate trade barriers. Every nation should trade freely with every other nation. Wilson understood one concept, and this is an era where this economic philosophy and diplomatic philosophy is really being pushed forward. You don't go to war with your business partners. You don't go to war with the people that you're doing trade with, right? People talk today, China is some sort of an adversary with the United States, right? First of all, China is definitely not an enemy of the United States. Don't even go there. But China is a rising power. China is a rising nation. China is considerably stronger on every level than it was a generation ago. And by every measure in another generation, China will probably be what we would consider a superpower. But we are not about to engage in any military conflict with China because China is our number 1 trading partner. And we need to do business with them, and they need to do business with us. And so whatever difficulties we have, we're going to negotiate them around the table. And that has proven to be the case over the past 20, 30 years. We always sit down with China and work with them because we work together economically. So the more linked we are to money, the more we will be likely to negotiate. So free trade. Everybody do business with everybody else. Everybody do business with everybody else. Finally, now again, there's 14 points of this. I'm only giving you a few. A League of Nations will be created. An international body where every country belongs, and the League of Nations will be designed to negotiate and resolve international disputes. No one nation controls the League of Nations. No one nation can avoid it. If there had been a League of Nations and a big table that all the countries could have sat around, when the Serbia-Austria issue happened, the League could have sorted it out. And when it really got bad, they're all around the table, aren't they? They can talk it out and talk it over. Like I said, Wilson was seen as naive. Wilson was seen as somebody who's trying to go way out of his lane. He was ridiculed, particularly by the French. Now, you have to understand, the French and the Belgians have just had their nations invaded. Millions have been killed by these Germans, but also enormous amounts of damage has been done to their country. Hundreds of years are going to pass before some of this land will be habitable again. There's entire regions in France now where nobody can live, even in 2020. And so the French are not in the mood to say we're all to blame, are they? And they're certainly not in the mood to all sit around the table and hold hands and say we'll just be friends again. That's not how it works. These Germans invaded our country. When the war first began, not only did the Germans commit horrible atrocities against the Belgians. I mean, they would go into these little Belgian villages and just line up all the men and just shoot them all against a wall. Every single man that was, potentially fighting age. Not only did Germany do that for no obvious reason, but the Germans bragged about it in their papers. I mean, the Germans were bragging to themselves about how we're doing this to the Belgians. Now, after the war, if you're the winner and you're Belgian, are you in the mood to be friendly with the Germans? Right? I don't think so. I don't think so. And so the idea is we're going to drop the hammer. We're going to make those Germans pay. This is a war of German aggression. This was Germany clearly trying to dominate Europe. After all, they made no secret of it before the war began. We're going to have our place in the sun, right? We're going to conquer our enemies. We're going to be like Bismarck and steamroll over all these weak states that get in our way. That's how things are done, right? They were bragging about it for years. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to make them pay, and we're going to make sure they can never do this again. I mean, we are going to teach them a lesson that they will not forget. They are going to be regretting what they did for a very, very long time. Now think about this one. Let's get into the mindset. If I'm a bully, go back to grade school, go back to high school, and I pick on you all the time, and I push you around, and I, humiliate you in front of everybody, am I going to stop being a bully by saying, okay, let's sit down and talk about this, right? We're going to go tell the principal, and they're going to send us to the guidance counselor, and they're going to put me in there and say, okay, what's your problem? Does that make the bully stop being a bully? How do you make a bully stop being a bully? You break his jaw, right? He pushes you in the cafeteria and you turn around and you punch him across the face so doggone hard, he will remember it, when he's in an old folks home. That's how you stop a bully from being a bully. Am I right? Yeah. I hate to say that. I hate to be that way. But, in all honesty, that is how it works, isn't it? Some people just don't get the memo. Some people have to be taught the hard way, right? And that's how civilization works. Our prisons are full of people who cannot get the memo. And so you know what we do? We don't sit around and try to talk them out of being criminals. We lock their asses up. So that's the German-Belgian attitude toward Germany. The French and the Belgian attitude toward Germany. We're going to teach them a lesson. We're going to make sure that they understand that they are now weak. We're going to punish them. We're going to make them pay. We're going to make them regret it. And we're going to make sure that this pain is felt for generations. Germany was stripped of all of its colonies, which is going to severely weaken the German economy and, of course, take Germany out of the entire conversation in terms of global influence. Germany is forced to turn almost its entire navy over to the Allies. That big navy that the Germans had spent so many years building is now British. And by the way, they sunk all of their ships. Germany brought them to the north of Scotland, and at the moment they were supposed to hand them over to the British, they scuttled every one of them and sunk them all. So there's a huge German ship graveyard at Scapa Flow off the north of Scotland. Germany was, of course, first forced to disband its entire military. Only a police-type military was allowed to be in place. I'm not about to let them have an army after this. Germany was forced to pay in gold a war debt to the Allies that was so substantial, it would have taken them roughly 90 years to pay off. It would have been paid off by now, but it would have been about the year 2000 that the Germans would have actually been able to pay it off. Every year they have to turn over X amount of gold to the British, to the French, to the Belgians, etc. Just a crippling war debt, specifically designed to make sure that the German economy was weak. Germany was also forced, and this really bugged them, Germany was also forced to formally admit all guilt for the war. This is known as the War Guilt Clause. Symbolic, of course, it doesn't mean anything. It really bothered the German people, though. Because again, they can easily point to Austria, Russia, Serbia. There's plenty of other nations with blame here, even if we acknowledge that Germany was the belligerent state. So to force the German government to formally say we're at fault for all of it was unnecessary and insulting. And it certainly was not going to encourage a healthy rebuilding. Germany, of course, was given no choice. They were forced to sign the Versailles Treaty. The Allies threatened to occupy Germany if they didn't. Woodrow Wilson left the left the Paris Peace Conference very bitter, very angry, because he had been so dismissed. And the only element of the 14 points that was enacted was the League of Nations. That was it. And the American public were really upset by this too, because again, the going logic there was that we saved Europe. We went over there and ended the war. We didn't have to do that. And now we're being treated like we belong at the little kids' table. And it really troubled the American public. A very strong sense of neutrality moved across the population. The American public are absolutely insisting we are never getting involved in something like this again. You know, if the Europeans go to war with each other, and they probably will, leave us out. I mean, we don't care if they burn the continent to the ground. It's not going to be our business anymore. We're not going to do it. As a matter of fact, the U.S. Senate wouldn't even join the League of Nations. The United States didn't join. And Wilson tried. He campaigned real hard to try to get the U.S. to join the League of Nations, but we wouldn't do it because we were so angry and so determined to remain neutral. And of course, as you can probably guess, the German economy was devastated as a result of the Versailles Treaty. Millions of young men are coming back. They can't work because they're wounded, or they can't work because they're so psychologically damaged from the war. German industry is in a really bad place. The new German nation, or the new German government, was called the Weimar Republic because the capital was moved there to the city of Weimar. It's Weimar Republic. It was incompetent. It was corrupt. There's a very, very strong socialist movement in Germany, of course, at this point, and so that's a big conflict internally. As I mentioned earlier, there was this going belief that we didn't really lose the war. You know, we were stabbed in the back. And very quickly after the war, Jews start being seen as kind of a scapegoat. You know, we associate this anti-Semitic propaganda with Hitler and the Nazis, but actually all across German society there is sort of this blame of the Jews. And former generals, for example, are coming back from the war, and they push this. A general by the name of Hindenburg, who was a very high-ranking general during the war, openly says, it was the Jews that stabbed us all in the back. And the reason there is the Jews are the financiers, the Jews are the bankers. And of course, he's arguing, they weren't willing to give us the money. They weren't willing to really help Germany. They weren't being patriotic. They were helping their Jewish brethren in places like France and Belgium. And they were all working together to make as much money off this war as possible. You know, Hindenburg argued, quite falsely, by the way, the data does not back this up, that Jews were not willing to serve in the military. You know, they all did these other jobs, but none of them were in the trenches and none of them were in the front lines because they're not patriotic people, according to Hindenburg. Now, that's been disproven. You know, proportionately, they were in the trenches just like everybody else. But That's not what people wanted to believe. And so anything but look at ourselves as the reason. And so it didn't take a lot for the Nazis, as they will continue to grow, to tap into this, because it's already kind of what the people are thinking. And yes, very shortly after the war, the Nazi Party did get founded, and it was founded as a social movement and a political party, one of many minor parties. And it was not founded by, our friend with the mustache and the comb over. Hitler joined the Nazi Party. He did not found it. But he very quickly rose in the ranks and became the leader of it. And this was in the early 1920s. Inflation in Germany skyrocketed. The German currency became worthless as the Weimar Republic just printed money off the presses nonstop. And if you print money, what you do is you increase the supply of the currency, and the currency becomes worthless. The whole point, the whole thing that gives the dollar any value is the fact that there's only so many of them, right? Dollars are not monopoly money. We just don't print them all the time, because if we did, they wouldn't be worth anything, right? There has to be a limited supply. And it's worth noting there's, plenty of critics right now that with the whole COVID stimulus and the way the government has been responding to the current economic issues, the government has been printing an awful lot of dollars, and all of the economists are saying that we're going to see inflation next year. We will see the value of the dollar go down considerably because so much of it is being printed, but we'll just have to wait and see, right? So anyway, the German currency effectively becomes worthless. At one point in the early 1920s, the Weimar Republic is printing so much money, and inflation has so taken over the economy that people were carrying around huge baskets of money just to buy simple items. A wheelbarrow of these worthless paper notes is required to buy a loaf of bread, that sort of thing. People were using the bills as wallpaper. They were using them as toilet paper. There's a story, I don't know, it's anecdotal, but this poor woman, who was like a widow, she had a child, they were very hungry and didn't have any money, and she's got this giant basket full of Weimar Republic currency. And she goes to the market to buy a loaf of bread, and it's so big, she goes into the store and she sits it down on the floor and goes to pick out the bread. And a thief runs in and grabs the basket, dumps the money off, and keeps the basket. That's the anecdotal story on this. And who knows if that really happened, but it, could have, and versions of that certainly did take place. The German social services are absolutely pushed to the limit because there's so many men that need medical care. So many men with grievous injuries that are going to require a huge amount of rehabilitation and will, of course, in many cases be permanently disabled, that the expense and the strain on society and taking care of all of them is also a problem. And that is also the case in Britain, also the case in France and these other countries. Just the millions of casualties that survived. It's just staggering. It's just staggering. One of the most notable conditions of the war that they were having a really hard time wrapping their head around is what was then called shell shock. And today we call it post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. You got to understand, there were times during the war where these men are subjected to the most, horrific atrocities imaginable, and they're being forced to perform them. Being forced to, bayonet other men and cut their heads off and, shoot them point blank, one after another, day after day. And it's just that'll mess you up, right? That'll put your brain on tilt pretty quick. There were instances where artillery barrages would go on for weeks and months at a time. We talked about the Somme. That was only one time when that sort of thing happened. And so just imagine going weeks and weeks and weeks where you literally cannot sleep because these kabooms are going off over and over and over again. And then, of course, you're being told, you got to go over the trenches and start, blowing people up and watching your friends, the psychological damage of World War I was absolutely astronomical. I'm going to pause this. I want you all to see a quick YouTube video, and I'll post it as a link online for those of you at home. Okay, those of you at home, I just showed a brief YouTube video, and I will post it because I want you to see it too. And it's a video of World War I veterans that were severe victims of PTSD, and it is a very eye-opening video. I think we would agree that in the classroom. That's really, really something to see. Very tragic. Anyway, very quickly, because we do need to wrap this up. By 1923, Germany was on the verge of political and economic collapse because it could not keep up with the payments, and its economy was just as bad as it could be. The United States came in and renegotiated the payments. This was known as the Dawes Plan. And this involved loaning Germany money and sort of bailing Germany out, stretching out the payments over a longer time. And by the mid-1920s, 1925, 26, we start to see a recovery. It's not, peaches and rainbows overnight, but we do start to see a recovery, and you can kind of understand why. The veterans have now put a few years between them and their war experiences. Generally speaking, they're going to get married. Again, part of the war involved, killing so many young men that it wasn't all that hard to find a wife if you were looking for one, because there were so many more eligible women than there were men. And again, that's got its own tragedy, obviously. But nonetheless, they're getting married. They're starting families. They're getting jobs. They're entering that next phase of life. And marriage and family has a tendency to mellow everybody out, and everybody loves children, and we did see a significant increase in the birth rate across all of the former belligerent powers. Economies are now starting to pick back up again. Trade is picking back up again. Certain friendships, or at least working relationships, are now being established between these former warring nations. And there was even a peace movement that emerged in the late 1920s, known as the Locarno movement. And Locarno is a city. And the Locarno movement was kind of a, peace, love, let's never go to war again ideology. And the spirit of Locarno was this idea that we'll always resolve our differences without resulting in conflict. And there was even a symbolic treaty signed, known as the Treaty of Locarno, which all of the former warring powers agreed that they would never fight each other again, and a new order of civilization really would be born. And we do start to see the reduction in armies. And there were some other issues too. For example, there was a big naval agreement in the 1920s, which significantly cut back how big navies could be. And it limited, for example, the tonnage of battleships and how many each nation could have, et cetera, et cetera. Now, thus, many people believe, maybe we can do this. Maybe we can make the Great War the last war. Maybe we will finally be smart enough to never be that stupid again. Boy, were they naive, weren't they? Because, of course, if you want to know what happened, it's the Great Depression, right? The economy was getting better. People were getting back to work. There was prosperity. There was trade. And then all of a sudden in 1929, stock markets across the Western world just collapsed. The Great Depression, as we have all heard, didn't just affect the United States. It hit Europe even harder. And all of that Locarno peace and love went down the drain as nations started blaming each other, and that desperation once again set in. Hungry people are angry people. And we're going to talk about that next time. So everybody take care, and I will see you on Tuesday.